Picture this. It's November of 1076, and Lord William de Montfort is standing in what should be the warmest room of his castle, his great hall. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. Ice is literally forming on the stone walls, inside. We're talking about a building with walls 6 feet thick, and it's so cold inside that you can see your breath clearer than you can outside on a January morning in Minnesota. Now, Lord William isn't some peasant scraping by. This guy is loaded. He owns lands stretching further than you could ride in 3 days. He commands 200 knights. His treasury could buy entire villages. But all that wealth? It's disappearing faster than money in a Vegas casino, and it's all going up in smoke, literally. By the time November ends, 50 wagon loads of oak have been fed into the fires of Castle Montfort. 50 wagon loads. To put that in perspective, that's an entire knight's yearly income. Gone. Burned. And for what? The hall is still, so cold that his children, noble children who should be learning Latin and swordplay, are huddled together like refugee kids, sharing body heat under piles of furs that cost more than most people see in a lifetime. Lady Margaret de Montfort has developed this cough that just won't quit. It's the kind of deep, chest-rattling cough that medieval people knew meant trouble. The kind that killed strong men and delicate ladies alike when winter stretched its fingers into stone castles. And the servants? They're dropping like flies. Not from plague or war or famine, from cold. In one of the most fortified, expensive buildings in all of Norman England. Then comes December, and Lord William himself collapses. Picture the scene. This powerful Norman lord, descendant of warriors who conquered England just 10 years earlier, crumples to the floor of his own great hall. His body temperature drops so low that the castle priest, a man who's seen death in all its medieval forms, begins, preparing the last rites. The ruler of thousands of acres is dying in his own home because he can't get warm. But here's what makes this story really fascinating. This isn't happening to just one unlucky lord. This is happening simultaneously across Europe. From the Scottish Highlands to the Italian Alps, the winter of 1076 is crushing the nobility in their own castles. The great forests that had surrounded every settlement for centuries, they've retreated. You now have to send a cart on a full day's journey just to reach decent timber. And the price? It's tripled in a single generation. Think about what this means. These massive stone fortresses, these symbols of Norman power and engineering, have become death traps. The very walls built to keep enemies out are now keeping warmth out and cold in. Those impressive thick walls that could stop a battering ram? They're storing cold like a refrigerator stores food. The old solutions are worse than useless. The Roman hypocausts, those ingenious underfloor heating systems that kept Roman villas warm for centuries, they're just piles of rubble now. 600 years of neglect have erased that knowledge completely. It's like having the blueprints for modern central heating and then forgetting how to read. The Anglo-Saxon longhouses with their primitive central fires, they work, sort of, but they consume entire forests' worth of timber and fill buildings with smoke that'll choke you. And these new Norman keeps, the massive rectangular towers that are supposed to represent the future of military architecture, they're frozen tombs, built for defense, designed to withstand siege engines and scaling ladders, but nobody thought about what happens when winter wages its own siege. Lords across Europe are facing an impossible choice that would make a modern CEO sweat. Bankrupt yourself buying fuel, abandon your castle during winter months like some kind of seasonal migrant, or find a complete revolutionary solution. And most of them are choosing bankruptcy because what's the alternative? A lord who can't hold his own castle isn't a lord for very long. But here's where our story takes a turn that'll make you appreciate human ingenuity. Lord William, probably delirious from hypothermia, makes a decision that'll change everything. He sends for Hugh of Durham. Now, Hugh isn't nobility. He's what we'd call a master builder. Think of him as a medieval architect and engineer rolled into one. But Hugh has something that makes him different from every other builder in England. His grandfather had been obsessed with Roman ruins. While other people saw ancient Roman buildings as convenient sources of pre-cut stone, Hugh's grandfather had actually studied them. He'd crawled through collapsed hypocausts, measured broken flues, traced the paths of vanished heating systems. When Hugh arrives at Castle Montfort in the depths of winter, he brings something revolutionary: the understanding that you don't fight cold with more fire. You make the building itself store and radiate heat. The revelation that changes everything comes when Hugh realizes that Roman builders hadn't just heated air, they had heated massive stone masses that would radiate warmth for days after the fires died. It's like the difference between holding your hands over a candle for warmth versus sitting next to a sun-warmed rock wall at sunset. Working through that brutal winter of 1077, Hugh transforms Castle Montfort's great hall. He moves all those scattered braziers and firepots into one central hearth. He creates a revolutionary double-walled chimney system that recycles the heat that would normally escape straight up into the sky. But most importantly, and this is the genius part, he teaches the stones themselves to remember warmth. By spring, something impossible has happened. Castle Montfort has become the warmest great hall in Norman England. Using half the Firewood it consumed the previous winter. Word spreads like wildfire through the networks of nobles, clergy, and master craftsmen. Everyone wants to know, how do you make stones remember heat? And that's where our story really begins. Because what Hugh discovered at Castle Montfort wasn't just a better way to heat a building. It was the beginning of a quest for thermal perfection that would consume the greatest minds of medieval Europe, create secret guilds guarding thermal knowledge like military secrets, and ultimately change the very nature of how human beings lived through winter. But the road to that revolution, it's going to be paved with espionage, mysticism, royal competitions, and engineering genius that'll make you wonder why we ever forgot these techniques in the first place. What happened next is going to sound like something out of a Dan Brown novel, but this is real history. Between 1100 and 1250, the quest for perfect heating became an obsession that merged mathematics, mysticism, and straight-up espionage. We're talking about master builders forming exclusive guilds and swearing blood oaths, 23, actual blood oaths, to protect their thermal secrets. Think about that for a second. These aren't military secrets or state treasures we're talking about. These are heating techniques. But in a world where staying warm meant the difference between life and death, between prosperity and bankruptcy, the knowledge of how to efficiently heat a great hall was worth more than gold. The Cistercian monks at Fountains Abbey stumbled onto something that'll blow your mind. These guys were obsessed with sacred geometry, Diore. The belief that God had embedded mathematical perfection into the universe, and that buildings designed according to divine proportions could channel heavenly light and spiritual energy. Sounds mystical, right? Well, here's the kicker. Their chapel, designed purely to channel divine light according to mathematical ratios, accidentally created perfect air circulation patterns. Brother Thomas of York, writing in 1132, describes entering the Abbey chapel on a January morning when ice covered every other building in Yorkshire, and finding the space warm enough that he could copy manuscripts without his hands cramping from cold. The monks were using maybe a tenth of the firewood that secular buildings required. They genuinely believed God himself had revealed the principles of thermal efficiency through prayer and contemplation. And you know what? They might not have been entirely wrong about the divine intervention part, because what they'd accidentally discovered was convection engineering that wouldn't be scientifically understood for another 600 years. But the real drama starts when word of these thermal miracles reaches the ears of kings and emperors. Frederick Barbarossa, A.T. And if you don't know this guy, he's basically the most powerful ruler in Europe at the time, A.T., decides he, wants the ultimate heated hall. And being a medieval emperor, he doesn't just commission one, he creates a competition. Picture this scene. Heidelberg Castle, 1187. Frederick commands what becomes known as the legendary thermal contest. Two master builders, Robert of Cologne, representing the German traditions, and Henry de Sens, representing the French innovations, each get identical budgets, identical-sized halls to construct, and one simple rule that'll make or break their reputations. They can burn exactly 20 logs per day through the entire winter. Whoever's hall stays warmest wins a fortune in gold and the title of Imperial Architect. Robert, playing it safe, builds what we'd recognize as a traditional Norman design: thick walls, corner fireplaces, solid craftsmanship. It's good work, the kind that had been keeping nobles alive for generations. Henri, though? Henri goes completely revolutionary. He constructs a central octagonal hearth, surrounded by what's essentially a double shell of stones, with carefully calculated air channels between them. He's building the medieval equivalent of a massive storage heater, but nobody's going to understand the science behind what he's doing for centuries. Through autumn, both halls perform similarly, but when winter really hits, and we're talking about a winter that killed thousands across the Holy Roman Empire, Robert's hall is barely staying above freezing, while Henri's maintains such consistent warmth that Frederick decides to hold his entire winter court there. The secret? Thermal mass. Henri's design heated 4 feet of stone depth that released warmth slowly for 72 hours after each firing, while Robert's fires heated air that escaped through every crack and crevice. Henri's fires heated stones that became radiators working around the clock. Word of this miracle spreads through the spy networks of medieval Europe faster than gossip in a high school. The French king sends agents, disguised as masons, to measure every dimension and study every joint. The English dispatch a princess for marriage negotiations, but her real mission becomes clear when her attendants are caught making detailed drawings of the heating system. Even the Pope sends observers, because if God is revealing thermal secrets to German architects, the Church needs to understand the implications. Master builders start encoding their plans in symbols more complex than anything Da Vinci would dream up. They're hiding blueprints in monastery crypts, creating the architectural equivalent of military secrets. Guilds form around thermal knowledge, with initiation rituals that include swearing never to reveal the positioning of air channels, the ratios of hearth size to wall thickness, or the sacred mathematics of convection flow. The Guild of Thermal Masters, established in 1205, required 7 years of apprenticeship before a candidate could even observe a master heating system under construction. Members identified each other through coded symbols carved into seemingly decorative stonework, a particular pattern of leaves on a capital column, a specific arrangement of geometric shapes around a doorway. These became the medieval equivalent of secret handshakes. By 1230, thermal espionage had become so intense that master builders travelled with armed guards. The plans for Winchester Cathedral's revolutionary heating system were stolen 3 times during construction. The master builder of Chartres Cathedral was kidnapped by agents working for the King of Castile, who wanted those thermal secrets for Spanish palaces. But here's what makes this whole story even more incredible. These medieval engineers were developing principles that modern science wouldn't formally understand until the Industrial Revolution. They were calculating thermal mass ratios through trial and error that matched mathematical formulas we didn't derive until the 1800s. They were designing convection systems that NASA engineers would recognize as sophisticated fluid dynamics. The competition reached its peak when the University of Paris established the first formal school for thermal architecture in 1248. Students came from across Europe to study what they called the sacred mathematics of warmth. The curriculum included geometry, astronomy, metallurgy, and what they termed stone medicine, the study of how different types of stone absorbed, stored, and radiated heat. And then something happened that would change everything. The Black Death arrived, and suddenly Europe had bigger problems than perfectly heated great halls. It went underground, preserved in guild secrets and monastery libraries, waiting for a world that would need it again. The stage was set for the golden age of medieval heating, XIMA, an era when the greatest halls of Europe would achieve thermal perfection that seems impossible by modern standards. Between 1250 and 1400, medieval heating reached a level of perfection that'll make you question everything you think you know about the Middle Ages. We're talking about spaces that could host 600 people through a December night using less wood than your modern suburban home burns in a week. And I'm not exaggerating. The numbers are documented in household accounts that survive to this day. Westminster Hall, under Richard II, becomes our perfect example. When completed, this space measured 240 feet long, 68 feet wide, with a hammer beam roof soaring 90 feet above the floor. To heat a space that massive using medieval technology should have been impossible, yet household records show they maintained comfortable temperatures using roughly the same amount of firewood that heated a modest manor house. The secret wasn't just the massive central hearth, though at 12 feet wide and 8 feet deep. It was impressive enough to roast an entire ox. The real genius was that the entire building functioned as an integrated heating system. Those walls, 6 feet thick at the base, weren't just structural. They were thermal batteries, absorbing heat all day and releasing it slowly through the night. Lady Margaret of Kenilworth, who chronicled daily life in 1320, describes winters that sound like fantasy to modern ears. She writes about tropical plants, FDT, actual plants brought back from the Crusades, thriving near the walls of the Great Hall through Yorkshire winters. Servants sleeping comfortably in the hall wearing nothing but simple wool tunics while snow piled 3 feet deep outside. Children playing barefoot on floor stones that stayed warm to the touch 3 full days after a fire died. Think about what this means for a second. These medieval engineers had figured out how to store solar energy before anyone understood what solar energy was. During the day, fires heated, massive stone walls that became radiators working through the night. The hammer beam roof wasn't just architectural showmanship. Those wooden beams created convection currents that circulated warm air without creating drafts. Even the rush-strewn floors played a role, trapping a layer of warm air at foot level, like a primitive form of radiant floor heating. But the real miracle was the efficiency. Modern thermal imaging of reconstructed medieval halls shows heat distribution patterns that mechanical engineers would kill for. The warmest spots were at sitting height around the walls, exactly where people spent most of their time. The coldest areas were up near the roof where nobody lived. Heat wasn't wasted warming empty air. It was directed precisely where human bodies needed it. This thermal perfection created a cultural revolution that reshaped medieval society. Remember, for centuries before this, winter meant survival mode. Households hoarded resources, cancelled travel, basically hibernated until spring. But now, resources once spent on mere survival could fund elaborate Christmas festivities lasting 12 full days. We're talking about feasts that would make modern holiday parties look modest. Travelling minstrels planned their winter routes around castles known for warm halls, carrying songs and stories from Scotland to Sicily. These weren't just entertainment venues, they became cultural exchange networks. A song composed in a warm hall in northern England would be heard in warm halls across France and Germany before summer arrived. The warm hall created the medieval equivalent of cultural globalization. But here's the part that'll really surprise you. These thermal innovations helped birth democracy. When Edward I summoned his model parliament in 1295, representatives could actually debate through winter sessions instead of rushing through frozen meetings and fleeing home before the roads became impassable. The House of Commons met in a hall so efficiently heated that members from northern Scotland could sit through January debates without frostbite. The Guild Craftsmen of London discovered that warm workshops meant year-round productivity. Delicate work requiring steady hands, illuminated manuscripts, fine metalwork, detailed stone carving, could continue through winter instead of shutting down for 4 months. This drove an economic boom that funded cathedral construction, supported universities, and created the prosperity that made the Renaissance possible. Master craftsmen guarded workshop heating secrets as closely as they protected their trade techniques. The Goldsmiths Guild developed heating systems so precise they could maintain different temperatures in different sections of the same workshop, one area for melting metals, another for detailed finishing work, a third for apprentices learning their craft. The Manuscript Illuminators Guild created heated scriptoriums, where monks could work with paints and inks that would freeze solid in unheated buildings. Nobles started designing their castles around the Great Hall, instead of treating it as just another room. The hall became the heart of the building, with all other spaces radiating out from this warm centre. Sleeping chambers were positioned to share walls with the great hall, allowing warmth to seep through stone partitions. Kitchens were integrated into the heating system, using cooking fires to supplement the hall's thermal mass. By 1350, the greatest halls of Europe had achieved something approaching thermal perfection. Canterbury Cathedral's chapter house maintained 68 degrees Fahrenheit through winter, using less fuel than a modern house uses for heating in a week. The Great Hall at Warwick Castle could host wedding feasts in January that were more comfortable than most modern venues. The technology reached its absolute peak at Kenilworth Castle under John of Gaunt. The Great Hall, there, completed in 1390, incorporated everything medieval thermal engineers had learned over 2 centuries. Multiple hearths worked in sequence, heating different sections of thermal mass throughout the day. Air channels hidden in walls created circulation without drafts. The floor itself was heated through a system of channels that would make Roman engineers proud. But even as medieval heating reached this pinnacle of efficiency, forces were gathering that would destroy this knowledge almost completely. Renaissance architects from Italy were beginning to mock these primitive northern designs. The Little Ice Age was making fuel even more scarce. And fashion, ITI, that eternal enemy of practical engineering, was demanding changes that would doom the Warm Hall to history. The Golden Age was about to end, and when it did, Europe would plunge into centuries of cold that wouldn't be resolved until coal became widely available. The tragedy is that the solutions already existed, they just needed to be remembered. The destruction of medieval heating knowledge is one of history's great tragedies, and it happened because of something you'd never expect: vanity. Renaissance architects from Italy looked at those magnificent medieval halls and declared them primitive and barbaric. They wanted something more refined, more classical, more Roman. What they got was disaster. The abandonment began with Italian fashion spreading north like a virus. By 1500, any self-respecting noble wanted their castle to look like a Roman villa, not a crude northern fortress. Out went the central hearths that had efficiently warmed entire halls. In came elaborate but utterly inefficient fireplaces scattered throughout multiple rooms. The Duke of Burgundy's new palace, completed in 1520, becomes our perfect example of how badly wrong this went. 43 separate fireplaces. 43! Each one requiring its own chimney, its own fuel supply, its own maintenance. The palace consumed 300 wagon loads of wood per winter, 6 times what a medieval great hall of similar size would use, while never achieving even basic comfort. But it looked Roman, it looked classical, it looked refined, and everyone froze. The problems went far beyond just inefficient fireplaces. Renaissance fashion demanded private chambers instead of communal spaces, which meant each room needed its own heat source. Large windows were stylish, never mind that they leaked heat like sieves. High ceilings made rooms feel grand, while trapping all the warm air uselessly above people's heads. Thin walls allowed for larger windows and more delicate decorative work, but couldn't store any thermal energy. Everything medieval builders had learned about working with natural heating principles was abandoned for aesthetic principles that fought against physics itself. The consequences were catastrophic, and I mean that literally. Deforestation accelerated across Europe as inefficient buildings devoured forests. By 1600, England had cut down 80% of its woodlands. France wasn't far behind. The poor, priced completely out of the firewood market, started burning furniture, books, anything combustible. Winter mortality rates doubled across northern Europe. Here's a detail that'll break your heart. In 1620, the library at Oxford University burned its entire collection of medieval manuscripts, not from fire, but as fuel. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, including architectural treatises describing thermal engineering techniques, literally went up in smoke to heat poorly designed Renaissance buildings. The energy crisis reached peak catastrophe during the Little Ice Age. From roughly 1650 to 1750, European winters became brutal enough to freeze the Thames solid for months. The old medieval solutions could have helped, but the knowledge was gone. Instead, people died. Lots of people. Winter. Mortality in London peaked at 30% during the worst years. Europe faced an energy crisis that wouldn't be solved until coal became widely available. Tows. And coal brought its own devastating problems. Air pollution, mining disasters, the industrial transformation that would reshape society completely. All because Renaissance architects thought central hearths looked primitive. But here's where our story takes a redemptive turn. In 1976, in Seveste, exactly 900 years after Lord William de Montfort nearly froze to death in his own castle, archaeologist Dr. Sarah Chen started excavating Chepstow Castle's original heating system. What she found changed everything we thought we knew about medieval technology. The 800-year-old Great Hall, when fires were lit experimentally, reached 70 degrees Fahrenheit and maintained comfortable temperatures using 60% less wood than the castle's Victorian additions. 60%. We're talking about technology that was 8 centuries old, outperforming 19th-century engineering. Modern thermal imaging revealed the medieval builders' genius in detail that would make contemporary engineers weep with envy. They had intuitively understood principles of thermal mass, radiant heating, and convection that modern science was only beginning to quantify with computer modeling. The stone walls weren't just thick for defense, they were calculated thermal batteries. The placement of the central hearth wasn't random, it was positioned at the mathematical center of convection currents that distributed heat with mechanical precision. Even the height of the ceiling was calculated to create optimal air circulation without wasting heat in empty space above human activity. Dr. Chen's discoveries triggered a revolution in sustainable architecture. The Grange estate in Hampshire became the test case. They rebuilt their Great Hall using authentic 12th century principles: central hearth, thermal mass walls, calculated air circulation, MEATN, and cut their heating bills by 70% while increasing comfort dramatically. Tech companies in Silicon Valley started constructing meeting spaces modeled on medieval halls. Google's headquarters includes a conference center based on Westminster Hall's proportions. Facebook built collaborative workspaces using medieval thermal mass principles. They found that communal warmth increased collaboration and creativity in ways that individual office heating never could. The sustainability movement embraced medieval heating like a lost treasure. Passive house design, thermal mass